Those who read the Bible 4 times a week were found to be 30% less likely to struggle with loneliness, 60% less likely to look at pornography, 228% more likely to share their faith with others, and 407% more likely to memorize the Bible. That is profound. The Bible will change your life if you allow it.
You've joined us for Mission 66, bringing the Bible to life, book by book and chapter by chapter. This program is brought to you by TWR in partnership with the Bible teaching ministry of Dr. Luis Sayao. John Matthews and Esther Sisulu are guiding us through the book of Numbers. You can follow along with your downloadable study guide at mission66.org. Now, here's Esther to get us started.
Welcome back to our study through the book of Numbers in the Old Testament. Now, this book follows the children of Israel from their exodus from Egypt through to their wandering in the wilderness, all the way up to the preparation to cross the Jordan River into the Promised Land. Now, our teacher, John Matthews, will take us to chapter 27 today with the theme, Lessons on Inheritance and Leadership.
Esther, thank you so much, and a very warm welcome to Mission 66. Wherever you join us from today, it is so good to be with you as we reach chapter 27 of the book of Numbers. And the Israelites, well, they're getting ready to conquer the promised land of Canaan. And we're going to find several important lessons that have to do with the tasks and the responsibility of leadership. So the first part of chapter 27 shows that leaders need to be flexible and fair in making decisions when no policy has been set that covers every question. In other words, where there's no obvious answer. And then the second part will deal with the transfer of leadership from Moses to Joshua. So let's start reading. Then drew near the daughters of Zelophehad, the son of Hepher, son of Gilead, son of Machir, son of Manasseh, from the clans of Manasseh, the son of Joseph. And the names of his daughters were Mahlah, Noah, Hoglah, Milcah, and Tirzah. And they stood before Moses and before Eleazar the priest and before the chiefs and all the congregation at the entrance of the tent of meeting, saying, Our father died in the wilderness. He was not among the company of those who gathered themselves together against the Lord in the company of Korah, but he died for his own sin. And he had no sons. Why should the name of our father be taken away from his clan because he had no son? Give to us a possession among our father's brothers. So this was a case where nothing had been written down, no instructions for what to do, when there was no son to take the inheritance from his forefathers. And one would think that it might be obvious that the daughters would be the beneficiaries, but it wasn't spelt out in the law. So this then called for a decision on, I suppose you could call it, a managerial level. And in this case, where there was no policy, well, Moses tried praying. And that is probably the wisest thing that he could have done. And verse 5 says, Moses brought their case before the Lord. And the Lord said to Moses, The daughters of Zelophehad are right. You shall give them possession of an inheritance amongst their father's brothers, and transfer the inheritance of their father to them. And you shall speak to the people of Israel, saying, If a man dies and has no son, then you shall transfer his inheritance to his daughter. And if he has no daughter, then you shall give his inheritance to his father's brothers. And if his father has no brothers, then you shall give his inheritance to the nearest kinsman of his clan, and he shall possess it. And it shall be for the people of Israel a statute and rule, as the Lord commanded Moses. And so we see here necessity becoming the mother of invention. And the Lord actually added an amendment to the law of Moses to cover the case of the 5 daughters of Zelophehad. And I think there are 2 things that we can note about this. The first thing is that the land was not given to the firstborn daughter, but to all 5 of them. They were expected to share equally. And the second thing to note is that here we find the first mention of the law of the near kinsman, where if a father has no brothers, the land is to be given to the nearest kinsman. And we'll actually see that take place in the book of Ruth, where Naomi's family sojourned away from Israel, but her husband died and both of her sons die as well, leaving only Naomi and Ruth. And because all the men had died, it left them destitute. So they had Naomi and Ruth, whose husband had died, and she stayed with her mother-in-law Naomi, who was also a widow. And to cut a long story short, Ruth meets a man called Boaz, who treats her well and qualifies as her near kinsman. Actually, he ends up marrying her and restoring the property that Naomi once had in Israel. It's a beautiful story, and we'll get to that when we study the book of Ruth. In a few minutes as well, we'll talk a little bit more about this idea of the kinsman redeemer and why it holds importance for us even today. But let's move on by reading now verse 12. And the Lord said to Moses, "Go up into this mountain of Abarim and see the land that I have given to the people of Israel. When you have seen it, you also shall be gathered to your people as your brother Aaron was, because you rebelled against my word in the wilderness of Zin, when the congregation quarrelled, failing to uphold me as holy at the waters before their eyes." These are the waters of Meribah of Kadesh in the wilderness of Zin. We learned about that in one of our episodes in Exodus, where Moses didn't follow instructions, but he struck the rock instead of speaking to the rock. A miracle happened and the rock brought forth water anyway. But because Moses didn't follow God's precise instructions, he was then forbidden to enter the promised land. However, by the grace of God, he would be permitted to see it with his eyes standing there on the Mount of Abarim. So now that Moses knew that his days were coming to an end, he turned his mind towards seeking his own replacement. Isn't that the mark of a good leader? That he should always be looking for a good qualified somebody to take over when he or she has left. Verse 15. And Moses spoke to the Lord, saying, "Let the Lord, the God of the spirits of all flesh, appoint a man over the congregation who shall go out before them and come in before them, who shall lead them out and bring them in, that the congregation of the Lord may not be as sheep that have no shepherd." And this was the right thing to do. Consult God, because he knows which of all those available people would be the best choice to succeed him as leader. So the Lord said to Moses, "Take Joshua, the son of Nun, a man in whom is the Spirit, and lay your hand on him. Make him stand before Eleazar the priest and all the congregation, and you shall commission him in their sight. You shall invest him with some of your authority, that all the congregation of the people of Israel may obey. And he shall stand before Eleazar the priest, who shall inquire for him by the judgment of the Urim before the Lord. At his word they shall go out, and at his word they shall come in, both he and all the people of Israel with him, the whole congregation." And Moses did as the Lord commanded him. He took Joshua and made him stand before Eleazar the priest and the whole congregation. And he laid his hands on him and commissioned him as the Lord directed through Moses. So Joshua was the best choice. He and Caleb, in fact, the only two of the 12 spies who came back from that recce into the promised land, who had a good report, and they were confident in good faith that they would and could conquer the land. But all the other spies, the other 10 who'd scoped out the land, were quaking with fear. And that fear proved infectious as it spread to the minds of the Israelites, and it went directly against God's promise and against Moses. And so God, as a result, sent the entire nation back into the wilderness to wander for 40 years until all the people who had listened to those spies and had doubted God had died. So an entirely new generation had risen up by this point. And the Israelites were as numerous now as they had been before, but only Moses, Joshua, and Caleb had survived from the previous generation.
You're listening to Mission 66, where we've been studying in Numbers, and we've seen that the promised land was to be split and divided among the different clans. And the family heads, the fathers, would possess their allotment of land, and it was to be handed down to the descendants, and this would last throughout the generations. But John, we see here that they had not yet conquered the land, had they?
No, they hadn't, but it was God's way of instilling this confidence in his people. He was assuring them of victory, which was no small thing if you're the people of Israel listening to this, but he was assuring them of victory by revealing ahead of time what was to be the allotment of the tribes, where the tribes were going to live in this land that they were about to take.
So we know that they had no brother to receive the inheritance when their father died, and so they had to bring their plight before Moses and the Lord, or they could have lost their inheritance. So why do you think God hadn't, I suppose, foreseen that this would be a problem and have Moses write it down as a policy before it was needed?
Yeah, it's a good question. In life, it is impossible to make a law or a policy manual that covers what to do in every single possible detail or situation that might occur. And the Lord used this situation with the daughters of Zelophehad to show everybody that he was far from an unreasonable God, and that he could also be approached whenever a question came up. And there were problems that did not exist then. Today we have to take our issues to God and ask his help in wisely evaluating things and knowing what to do. We often don't know if we're getting the right information, and we can ask him to send us what is true and best. And in this case, God says to Moses, what Zelophehad's daughters are saying is right. You must certainly give them property as an inheritance amongst their father's relatives. And by this, he's saying women have rights. And it should be pointed out that it would have been very unusual for a man to have 5 daughters and no sons. Now, we might say that the situation seemed to catch God by surprise, but nothing ever catches him by surprise, really. The case of the daughters of Zelophehad was possibly entered into Numbers as a lesson to us that when we arrive at a situation that hasn't been covered by specific instructions, then we should always go to God with our requests, and he will give us an answer that satisfies the need. You know, the closer we are to God, though, the closer we are to his wisdom, to his understanding, his grace, his love. The closer we are to him, the closer we are to becoming more like him and being able to discern the answers to difficult questions and situations in life. And how do we grow close to God? Well, we grow close to him through praying to him and reading the Bible. Let me share this with you, because a recent study of 650,000 people all over the world aged between 8 and 80 by the Center of Bible Engagement showed that there was little transformation in the lives of those who put time aside to read the Bible between 1 and 3 times a week. But there was significant change in the lives of those who read the Bible 4 times a week or more. So when someone reads the Bible more than half of the days in the week, 4 times a week, this is what they found. Those people were 30% less likely to struggle with loneliness. They were 60% less likely to look at pornography. They were 228% more likely to share their faith with others. They were 407% more likely to memorize the Bible. Isn't that profound? The Bible will change your life, but God needs to be our priority. And reading His Word, the Bible, if prioritized, brings real life change. It brings wisdom and discernment in situations too, which is the point of this question.
Absolutely, John. Firstly, those statistics are so encouraging to hear, but I also think about the encouragement my grandmother used to share with us is that, we should read the Bible for situations like what you mentioned, but also to pray. Whenever you feel you're in doubt, just pray. And I think we can all be encouraged by that as well. Now, as we continue to follow along in the story of Zelophehad's daughters, the instruction by God includes the idea of the near kinsman. And this was a concept that you said we'd talk about. So let's go ahead and delve into that right now. What would you say about it?
So a near kinsman, Esther, or sometimes someone who's otherwise known as a kinsman redeemer, is a male relative who's got the responsibility to help another relative in need. Genesis chapter 38 talks about this, and if a man's brother dies, it was his duty as a kinsman redeemer to marry his brother's widowed wife and raise up children on behalf of his dead brother. But this goes way beyond marital duties. And so if a relative runs into debt, then a kinsman redeemer helps them out. Leviticus chapter 25 has a whole list of possible ways that the kinsman redeemer should help so that their relatives don't lose their property. And widows had a really tough time of it in those days. And in the instance of Ruth, for example, she had lost her husband, and so she had to scrounge for food herself, and her mother-in-law Naomi. So she'd go into the fields during harvest and look for any scraps that the harvesters had missed. And when she's doing this, she's noticed by a man called Boaz. He sees Ruth picking up leftovers and has this sense of compassion towards her. Then Naomi, the mother-in-law, finds out that Boaz is a near kinsman. A distant relative is another way to say that. He urges Ruth to appeal to him to do his duty as her kinsman redeemer and marry her, which he does. And so it's a happy ending. But in the New Testament, Jesus fills the role of a kinsman redeemer for us because he redeems us from sin. He pays our debts. In a way, he marries us because the church is called the bride of Christ. He adopts us into the family of God. Now, Ruth wasn't Jewish, but she converted to Judaism. And because of her marriage to Boaz, she actually becomes the great-grandmother of Israel's King David. And by extension, she was also one of the ancestors of the Messiah through the lines of both his mother Mary and his legal father Joseph.
Well, that was a great explanation there, John. I think we now have a much better understanding of this concept of the kinsman redeemer. But I do want us to head back to Numbers, because now in the choosing of Joshua as Moses' successor, we, of course, without a doubt know that God knew that Joshua was the best pick. But wouldn't it be the case that if a leader is picked by God, that the man's qualifications for the job will be evident to the people, they would also be able to see the qualities that he had and that he was qualified for this job.
Yeah, I'd say that generally holds true, Esther. You know, good leaders can be recognized by their character. Joshua had the backing of the people, as we saw in verse 22. The Bible tells us that Joshua was a man in whom the Spirit of God dwelt. So Joshua was spiritually prepared. He was physically able, and he was submissive to spiritual authority. That is, he submitted to having the priest lay his hands on him here, commissioning him. And he wasn't proud, but he was humble. As the Faith in Action Study Bible puts it, the person who really knows God humbly and joyously will reflect God in his or her behavior. And this is only possible as a consequence of complete reliance on him and total surrender to him, enabling his life to be lived through us. And isn't that what heaven will be like?
Well, let's actually stay on that note, John, because here we see Moses laying his hands on his successor, commissioning him. I'd like to know what the significance of this is. Is it still a valid ritual that we can perform today?
Well, Hebrew culture was expressive, and one of those expressions was the laying on of hands, and it signified the conferring of authority from one to another. And the hands are symbolic of things being done. If we move it into the New Testament times, we see Jesus healing sick people by touching them, by laying his hands on them. And so in a modern day setting, it's a sign of conferring blessing or power, offering someone into God's keeping and presence, inviting the Holy Spirit to do his revealing, transforming work.
Well, speaking of conferring authority from one person to another, and this is simply just my own observation, John, but Moses must have been a pretty tough person to follow after. And I say this because it's written that there had never arisen a man like Moses, whom God spoke with face to face. What do you think of that?
Yeah, you're right. Tough act to follow. No prophet has arisen in Israel like Moses. But Moses' authority was being passed on now to Joshua, not Moses' personality or his talents, because Joshua, even though a great leader and a capable military general, would never be Moses, nor would anyone else be like King David or the Apostle Paul or any of the other great characters in the history of the Bible. People are different, and you and I are not expected to be anybody other than who God made us uniquely to be. And each of us is unique. We are individuals endowed with whatever gifts or limitations that God sees wise and fit.
Well, this has been so great, John, as always. And I think right now we can go ahead and summarize what we've learned in Numbers 27.
Yeah, today then the theme was lessons on inheritance and leadership. The law, well, it didn't have any specific instructions as to how to pass on inheritance when a man only had daughters and no son. Moses had to go to God with the question, well, what do we do in this situation? God quickly reveals a perfect common sense solution to the question concerning Zelophehad's daughters. We also see in the chapter how God, who knows the hearts and the abilities of every person, instructs Moses to choose Joshua as his successor. In coming episodes in the Old Testament, we're going to see why that was a good pick.
And John and myself certainly extend the invitation to you to join us next time as we continue our study through the book of Numbers. And our friend, if it so happens that you've missed out on an episode or two of Mission 66, Well, please know that you can listen to past programs wherever you get your podcasts or at twr360.org. Also, be sure to follow us on our Facebook and Instagram pages. Simply type in Mission 66 in the search line. So until next time, from myself and John, goodbye and God bless you.
As we close today's program, take a minute to download your free study guide. You'll be able to follow along every single day. Plus, you can engage with the reflection and application questions so you can apply the teaching to your life. It's a great companion resource to the audio Bible teaching of John Matthews and Esther Sisulu. To get your free study guide, visit mission66.org. That's mission66.org. You can also support the ministry of Mission 66 when you visit the site. Your gift makes it possible for this great teaching to be heard in many languages around the world. Mission 66 is a ministry of Transworld Radio in partnership with Dr. Luis Sayao.